Welcome to the ISG seminar this week. My name is Irman Mitular. I'm a fellow with the Indonesia project. I will be the chair for this seminar today. I would like to start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. Although we are moving towards a in-person only event for the future ISGs, the talk today will be a hybrid event. We'll have two speakers. Joining us here is Dr. Kate Solis, and from Jakarta, Dr. Herdian Maulana. Dr. Kate Solis is a research fellow at the University of Tasmania. Her research focuses on analyzing the well-being benefits of nature connection. She's also a consultant with the Center for Policy Development, working on a project examining the benefits of child well-being policy approaches. She will be joined by Dr. Herdian Maulana, PhD from Queensland University of Technology, who is now a lecturer and the head of department of the Master of Science in Psychology program at University Negeri Jakarta, UNJ, with a special interest in well-being and quality of life studies. So Kate will give a short overview of the presentation today, and then Herdian will talk about for 15 minutes, and then we move back to Kate to talk about 30 minutes. And then we'll move to Q&A. We'll be taking questions for those in the room, as well as online. Those online can write their question in the Q&A box, and we will read them up. We also like to note that today we plan to end the event at 1:55 p.m. because the room is going to be used for another event.
Thanks so much, Mas Firman, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's really great for Mas Herdian and I to have the opportunity to present today. So the topic is measuring well-being in Indonesia, and I suppose to give a bit of context about how Mas Herdian and I kind of came together. So my previous research has focused on essentially the value of asking the question, what does well-being mean to you, and developing context-specific well-being measurement tools. So from that interest, I got in touch with Herdian, who, as you will find out shortly, has developed the Indonesian Well-being Scale, which is developed in consultation with people in Indonesia. And so we're going to kind of focus essentially together on the value and challenges of these kind of well-being measurement tools. So Herdian will first talk about the development of the Indonesian Well-being Scale, and then I'll talk about how we applied that tool for analysis within a survey in Jayapura. So yeah, really looking forward to the presentation and discussion, and I'll hand over to Herdian to take us on.
Okay, Herdian, 15 minutes, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank everyone, the Indonesian study group, Pak Firman, and of course, Kate, for inviting me to join this very wonderful seminar. A little bit nervous here, so this is now in Jakarta, a little bit cloudy. So I would like to share to all of you about how I developing a well-being Indonesian measure that actually comes from my doctoral study when I was in Australia. So that's very interesting finding in 2012. So this is actually the background of why I'm studying about well-being. So in 2012, PISA study released a very interesting result that Indonesian students was among the lowest in mathematics and science academic. However, the PISA study also asking one interesting question about how happy students in the class. So surprisingly, Indonesian students, instead of being very low in score in mathematics and science, they were among happiest students in the world. So based on this finding, there's some problem that I think need to be addressed. First, I'm asking whether how we experience or understand well-being is similar, and the consequences leading to the second issue. If it's not similar or different, then it will impact on how we measure it. So this is all the everything start. So well-being instrument developed in non-Western nation have been extensive for the last one decade. So and like this is in most of the Asian countries. However, there's a lack of well-being studies in Indonesia that using culturally appropriate scale that sensitive to how Indonesia understand their social, cultural, psychological perspective about what they think about happiness, what they think about well-being. So based on that phenomena, I'm addressing some research gap on my study. So that's actually quite a lot. However, I just want to underline some of it. We have very limited studies in Indonesia about well-being, and those limited study mostly use existing well-being measure that develop and test in Western developed country that focus on more individualistic culture rather than collectivistic perspective, like how Indonesian feels about their life. So based on that research problem, so I'm wondering whether Indonesian have a similar understanding about what is well-being or what is happiness and how it's defined and how the existing scales are culturally valid. These two questions leading to an attempt to develop a new scale that I'm hoping at that time can bridge this gap. A scale, well-being scale that more culturally sensitive to Indonesian population. So this is the overview of the study. Just quick on this. So the first and second study were actually based on a qualitative study involving more than 30 Indonesian samples, asking about how they understand and experience well-being and what aspects that might be relevant for them. And then I'm also trying to ask them whether the existing well-being instruments developed in industrialized West countries are really culturally appropriate. Most of the quantitative studies conducted in Indonesia, including this is my critic on the Indonesian family life survey. One of quite is using the well-being instrument that using the hedonistic perspective from a dinner about well-being, about how they understand well-being. So this will be another discussion. However, these two qualitative study leading to the phase 2 study that I'm developing a well-being based on the initial qualitative study I found. So this is a bit about the research method before I jump into the results. So this is just a glimpse of the method of my study, and then yeah, this is the study tree. I don't want to discuss more on technical things. However, this is how I'm doing my study on developing the scale. So I'm using both exploratory and confirmatory analysis, including test-retest and convergent validity for the subscale. And I just want to give you a overview about what I found with my qualitative study. So actually, this is how Indonesian understood well-being. So it comes in 3 basic themes: how they fulfill their needs, how they maintain their social relation, including with families, both also with neighborhoods. They surrounds social environment. They close, like for example, their neighbors and their community. Also, the worldview. This is another thing that related to more psychological aspect related to how they perceive life and how they perceive their relation with their God, spirituality. And based on this qualitative finding, this is what I'm trying to do. So I'm developing a well-being instruments that trying to address the gap and the problem related to socio-cultural item biases that I found also in my previous qualitative studies to bridging the meaning and equivalence. So this is what I found. contextualize the item according to the specific social and situational context from the existing well-being study that I developed, and trying to apply and infuse more social perspective on how Indonesian connect to one each other. And this is what I've got. So I found there's 4 distinct indicators of well-being of Indonesian. First is the spirituality related to how they relate with the higher beings, like say, and then the social relation related with how they satisfy with their social interaction, including the community, and then their self-acceptance related not only accept their life in individualistic way, but also related with their life, their family. So it's like more positive attitude and unconditionally accept life. And then also the last thing related to basic needs cannot be separated, that most of the economic indicator related to well-being indicated that financial condition, income also positively correlate with how people feel their well-being. So it also included in this scale. And then, so this is what I've got. Indonesian well-being. I'm hoping that this could be a skill that culturally driven and both can culturally specific address for Indonesian social characteristics, and then also cover most of the important things that Indonesian perceive as what is or how they experience well-being, including self-acceptance, basic needs, social relation, and spirituality. So yeah, I think that's all. I got 15 minutes for presentation. Hopefully this can useful for everyone, and looking forward for any question, critics, and feedbacks. So I think that's all from me. I think we'll switch to Kate. Kate, back to you. Thank you so much. Sorry, I cannot hear your voice, Kate.
So while we're just getting the slides up, so following on from Hervian's talk, so really it's fantastic to kind of have this very context-specific well-being measurement tool available for analysis in Indonesia. And so what I'll be going through now is essentially applying that index or that scale within a survey. So partly to better understand the migrant well-being gap in Jayapura, which I'll discuss in a second. But with the secondary purpose of better understanding the value of applying this kind of context-specific wellbeing measurement tool for analysis, and the challenges and limitations in doing that as well. Yeah, so I'd like to acknowledge, this study was done as part of a team. So Pak Budi, Mas Firman, Mas Wiswondi, and Pak Julius were all part of the team to firstly collect the data for this survey, but also for the analysis as well. And I should note up front, so this analysis focuses on the context of Papua and Jayapura. I'm not an expert in Papua. My knowledge to the team is really more about kind of the wellbeing measurement side of things. So we're certainly getting into some of the details of the findings from the study, but also having probably a bit more of a focus on kind of the wellbeing measurement side and how we can kind of make best use of this kind of measurement tool, specifically in the context of Indonesia as well. So firstly, a bit of motivation, background and methodology for this study. So the focus of the study, so the aim was to essentially examine the migrant wellbeing gap in Jayapura. So essentially the difference in wellbeing between people who were born in Jayapura and people who migrated to Jayapura. And of course, so what we're interested in is using the Indonesian Well-being Scale to undertake this analysis. Obviously don't need to say too much more about the Indonesian Well-being Scale. Fabian's already given a really great introduction of that. So what was the motivation for this study? So firstly, as I've already mentioned, a key purpose from kind of the analysis point of view was to investigate the value of applying this kind of context-specific wellbeing measurement tool for analysis. But of course, there's also quite a significant research gap in terms of the migrant wellbeing gap. So a lot of the research and literature that exists was conducted in Europe and other Western countries. And as you can imagine, those results are not really generalizable to the Indonesian context at all. There's very different reasons for migrating within Europe compared to migrating within Indonesia. So there hasn't been a huge amount done within that literature in the Indonesian context. So conducting this research really kind of filled a really important research gap there. So there have been some studies conducted on migrant well-being in the Indonesian context. So Lou has conducted a number of studies using the Indonesia Family Life Survey. As many of you would know, that data collection doesn't extend to Papua, so there's already quite a clear gap there. So also the variables and wellbeing measurement scales within the Indonesia Family Life Survey tend to be more global scales and not specific to the Indonesian context like the IWS is. There has also been a study done by SEDA which did focus on West Papua. So those results are a little bit closer to what we were looking at, but that also didn't use a context-specific measurement tool. So we kind of have trying to fill research gaps from a few different angles within this study. As you would know, so I mean, within Papua, we see very high levels of conflict and unrest. So these may exacerbate wellbeing differences between migrants and non-migrants in Jayapura, which is important to examine. And finally, the transmigrasi policy within Indonesia makes Indonesia and Papua specifically quite a unique context to examine the migrant wellbeing gap. So the key research questions, kind of in a very simplistic form that we were seeking to answer, is firstly, does a wellbeing gap exist between migrants and non-migrants in Jayapura? If such a gap exists, are there certain population groups driving that difference? And finally, if a wellbeing gap exists, are there certain dimensions of wellbeing driving that difference? So throughout these results, I'll be really just looking at kind of the statistical analysis, but I will come back to the wellbeing measurement side of things in the discussion. So in terms of the survey details, so this uses secondary data from a household survey undertaken in Jayapura. I say secondary, so I was involved in the primary data collection as were Budi and Firman. I say secondary because the primary purpose of the survey was actually to look at the long-term impacts of contracting malaria as a child. So obviously a very different topic to what I'm presenting today. The survey was incredibly extensive, so it took up to 2 hours for households to complete. It had a very large number of questions and data items. And so what we found when we looked at kind of the sample makeup is that there were a really high proportion of migrants in the Jayapura part of the survey. And so we thought, and we also asked quite a few questions on migration. So we thought it was a really valuable opportunity to look at this topic. So the data was collected in January 2020 in Jayapura. I should note that the survey was also undertaken in Ambon as well. We didn't look at that because there were a very, very small number of migrants in Ambon, which is why we focused on Jayapura. We were meant to also do data collection in Kupang as well, but as you can see from the January 2020 timestamp, we were about to, I think we were doing it in March or April 2020 and COVID hit, which put a hold on things. But we were really fortunate that we were able to at least get those 2 study sites completed. So as I mentioned, the primary purpose of the data collection was to understand the long-term health, educational and wellbeing impacts of contracting malaria as a child. We used a stratified random sampling technique, which randomly selected geospatial units. And the total sample size for the Jayapura part of the survey was 298 households, made up of 694 respondents. So we surveyed several respondents in the same household. I believe it was everyone aged 15 to 60 from memory. So the outcome variables we were interested in for this study, so as we've already mentioned, the Indonesian Well-being Scale was the primary outcome variable. And we also included two more global happiness or life satisfaction questions within the survey as well. So the life satisfaction scale asked, please think about your life as a whole and how satisfied are you with it? And the second was a happiness scale asking, taking all things together, how would you say things are these days? And we did analysis using all these outcome variables, which we'll get to in just a moment. So to go through the results. So firstly, this graph shows the Indonesian Well-being Scale score by migrant status. So the y-axis is essentially a mean of the different responses to the 20 items in the IWS. And so we can see here, so non-migrants, this is well-being score here with a 95% confidence interval. And so migrants from both outside of Papua or West Papua. So migrants included people who had moved from within Papua to Jayapura, and migrants from a completely different Indonesian province had significantly higher well-being compared to non-migrants. However, as we know, it could well be certain characteristics of migrants that are kind of causing this result. So we did some modelling where we controlled for a number of socio-demographic variables. So I don't have the full model output, just in terms of kind of keeping everything to a simple page. But you're welcome to kind of have a look at the paper for a full set of the results. But the controls that we used were gender, religion, village, marital status, age, BMI, education level, salary, whether the individual owns land, the house size, and the housing quality. And so, this output shows the coefficients for the Indonesian Well-being Scale. And we can see again, so migrants from another Indonesian province had significantly higher well-being than those who were born in Jayapura. So that's significant at the 1% level. And we did also see significance at the 10% level for migrants who migrated from within Papua or from West Papua. Yes, still significant, but kind of 10% is kind of a relatively low level of significance. So kind of a bit less uncertainty about that finding, but migrants from another Indonesian province, that's highly significant at the 1% level. What we find when we look at the life satisfaction and happiness scales is we see no significant difference between migrants and non-migrants. And so this was a really interesting finding that we thought needed a little bit more exploration. And to provide some kind of deeper insight into this finding, it's interesting to look at the distributions of these different outcome variables. So firstly, this is a histogram of the IWS scores. So we can see it's relatively normally distributed. We see this big spike at 4. It does kind of sit towards the positive end of the scale, but we do see quite a bit of variation amongst the sample. When we look at happiness and life satisfaction, we do see quite a bit less variation. So if we look first at happiness, pretty much everyone is saying they're happy or very happy. I think they don't show up on the bars. I think the numbers are so small. I think there are maybe a couple of people who kind of were at the lower end of the scale. And we see a similar finding for life satisfaction as well, although maybe a little bit more variation here. Now, it could well be that people are just genuinely happy and very satisfied with their context. It could also be, however, and there are kind of a few reasons for this difference in variation between the IWS and these two scales. Firstly is the fact that these are just unidimensional scales. They're literally just one question that's asked within the survey, whereas the IWS asks a series of 20 questions. So by design, it's going to be a lot more nuanced than these global unidimensional scales. Another reason potentially that could be influencing this result is the cultural context in Indonesia. So one really interesting finding from Herdian's study, when he went and asked people, what does well-being mean to you? That sense of gratitude was incredibly important, and being grateful for what one has. And so potentially within the Indonesian context, maybe it goes against one's values to say that you're unhappy. And that could also be what's driving kind of this, this lack of variation amongst the sample with these two questions. So, I mean, having the IWS, which is A, culturally relevant, and B, goes into a lot more detail and asks a lot more questions about one's well-being, provides a much more nuanced perspective and might be causing that greater variation, which allows us to see differences that we might not necessarily see with these more standardized scales. So digging into those findings a little bit deeper, we can look at a couple of aspects and features about what might be driving this wellbeing gap. So first is looking at where people are actually migrating from. So we had information on where people were born, and that's these coefficients here. So we can see that the wellbeing gap appears to be driven predominantly by people migrating from Sulawesi. That was at the 1% level. And Java, that was at the 10% level. Just noting again, I mean, we're getting into relatively small sample sizes here. So I'd hesitate some sort of caution in analysing those results. I mean, it could be that the other provinces are also influential, but the sample sizes were quite low. We also looked at the age of migration. So within the migration literature, there's a lot of evidence to suggest acculturation. So essentially, the longer people are in the receiving country for, the more their well-being kind of conforms to the average of the receiving area. And so we did have an indicator that asked whether people migrated, whether they were before 12 years old or after 12 years old. And we found no significant difference between this. So we didn't find any evidence of acculturation at the time. Again, to dig into that finding, it was only at the 10% level, but regarding migrants from within Papua or from West Papua having higher levels of well-being to those who are born in Jayapura, we did a little bit more analysis. So we looked at whether people came from the island regions, from the coastal regions, from the mountain regions, or from West Papua. And we found that the data suggests that that kind of well-being gap amongst migrants and non-migrants from who were within Papua or West Papua is driven predominantly by people who migrated from the mountain regions. Again, we're looking at pretty small sample sizes here. There were only 14 people, respondents who were from the mountain regions. So I think kind of unpacking this result requires maybe a little bit more research, but an interesting finding nonetheless. And so finally, another real benefit of the Indonesian Well-being Scale is the multidimensionality. So we can look into the different dimensions of well-being that might be driving this well-being gap. So firstly, when we look at migrants who are from another Indonesian province, we find significant differences in all dimensions, so spirituality, basic needs, and self-acceptance. Interestingly, we also found difference in social relations, which was somewhat unexpected. A lot of the migration literature suggests, unsurprisingly, that when you kind of move to a new place, when you're a migrant in an area, you're going to have lower social connections with people. Your family may not be there. You have less opportunity to establish kind of connections with peers and so forth. So it's interesting that that result was still significant, that migrants had significantly higher social relations than those who were born in Jayapura. For migrants who were from Papua or West Papua, we found significant differences amongst the spirituality domains and self-acceptance domains, but not amongst the social relations and basic needs domains. So I presented quite a bit there, so to synthesize it into just kind of one slide, we firstly found that migrants have significantly higher well-being than non-migrants, and that's even after controlling for a number of variables. And that's according to the IWS. The happiness and life satisfaction scales showed no such difference, and that's potentially due to them being global unidimensional scales. The fact that they're not contextually nuanced, may have had some bearing on that as well. So we saw that the higher well-being of migrants from outside Papua and West Papua is driven by those from Sulawesi and Java, although I hesitate some caution about sample size there. And the high well-being of migrants from inside Papua, West Papua is driven by those from the mountain regions. We saw no difference based on what age individuals migrated, and the well-being gap for those who migrated from outside Papua, West Papua was evident across all 4 well-being dimensions, and for the spirituality and self-acceptance domains from migrants from within Papua West Papua. So before I go into discussing these results a little bit more, I just want to note a few limitations on the study. So firstly, due to the nature of this survey not actually being for the purpose of looking at migration, we had relatively limited variables on migration. Obviously, if we were doing this study with the primary purpose, looking at this topic, we would have asked a lot more in-depth questions about when people migrated and where they came from, and if their parents were migrants and so forth. So unfortunately, we don't have that more detailed information that we could look into things a bit more deeply. We weren't looking at causal inference at all within this study. We weren't looking at whether the migration process results in people having higher or lower levels of well-being. We need longitudinal data for that. And Lou, as I mentioned before, so has done a little bit of work on this, and I'll talk about Lou's results in the discussion in a few minutes. And also, I don't think Herdian quite got time to mention this, but in the IWS, there was relatively limited consultation with individuals who are from Papua. So the vast majority of the qualitative research he did, which engaged with individuals and asked, what does well-being mean to you, was with people in Java. So I'll talk about kind of the scalability and the challenges associated with that in just a moment. So to discuss these results and come up with some key takeaways. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit more about why this well-being gap might be there. And these are all pretty speculative. However, I think drawing on the existing literature, we can have a bit more certainty about some of these possibilities than others. So the first is the happy migrant hypothesis, which is talked about a lot in the migration literature. And it's essentially suggesting that people who migrate have characteristics that predispose themselves to be happier or higher well-being or higher physical health or whatever outcome you want to look at. And so, for example, people who migrate might tend to have greater levels of financial security, which enable them to migrate, or they might be more likely to have greater risk-taking behaviours, which causes them, which enables them to migrate and inherently may make them kind of happier. I suspect that's probably not the case. I think there are kind of deeper and more structural issues at play than just kind of the happy migrant hypothesis, but it is one potential explanation. What I think is probably more likely is when we look at kind of the core difference between migrants and non-migrants in Jayapura is that non-migrants were not, they grew up and spent some time in a place, outside of Jayapura. And so we know from the existing literature that the well-being of individuals in Papua is substantially lower than most other provinces. So it might be that migrants, happen to grow up in families with high levels of financial security, which kind of enables that kind of greater well-being, which lasts, beyond their move. However, migrants from mountain regions in Papua also had higher well-being. So these kind of, I think that those kind of two results need to be looked at in conjunction to better understand these findings a little bit more. Just to point out that unexpected finding regarding social relations, whereby migrants in Jayapura had higher social well-being than non-migrants, and that should be explored a little bit more. And finally, there could be a causative factor at play. So perhaps migrant well-being has improved as a result of the migration process. From the existing literature, I suspect that this isn't the case. So Lou did the study using the Indonesia Family Life Study, and found that the migration process within Indonesia actually result in higher levels of psychological distress and lower levels of well-being. So I suspect that's not the kind of explanation for the finding that we came up with. So what are the implications of these findings for policy in Indonesia? So firstly, I think this kind of research is really important to look at the potential social impacts of transmigrasi. We know that kind of this mass migration within Indonesia has a huge amount of social and environmental consequences, and could be a big explanation for this well-being gap that we've seen. And related to this is potentially the fact that this well-being gap exists, and if that's noted and observable and obvious to people within Jayapura, that in itself could kind of perpetuate well-being to continue to exacerbate further and further. So we know that inequality more generally results in lower levels of well-being. So well-being inequality in itself might end up resulting in higher levels of well-being inequality and reduced well-being. There are potential policy levers we can draw on to help, decrease this gap. So, for example, providing greater educational opportunities to non-migrants, implementing policies to improve social cohesion amongst non-migrants, and also strengthening affirmative action policy as well. So the third discussion point is, just to touch on the high value in using a context-specific wellbeing scale. And I hope this has kind of come through from the results so far. So that kind of greater sensitivity that I talked about, that the IWS inherently being multidimensional and being context-specific, seem to allow for greater sensitivity and greater nuance in better understanding the wellbeing gap. These kind of wellbeing scales that are developed in consultation with communities and encompass a large number of dimensions of wellbeing are inherently multidimensional, and so that allows us to dig quite deep into what the wellbeing gap might be driven by. If we were to find differences in wellbeing using the life satisfaction scale or the happiness scale, that would have been quite interesting, but there's nowhere really we can go with that. We don't really know why that difference might be there or how. And so by having these dimensions of wellbeing, we can dissect that a lot more. And so, we found that for people who had migrated from outside of Papua, West Papua, that it was across all dimensions, but from migrants within Papua, it was only a couple. And finally, I think this is really most important, that we can be more certain that we're measuring what matters. By having a tool that's been developed in consultation with the community and has been developed with the context and culture in mind, we can just have more certainty that we're measuring the important things for wellbeing. But that's not to say that challenges exist. And there are obviously some tensions when you're doing this kind of analysis, and some questions and some doubts. And I just wanted to draw on those a little bit. And I think the most important one is scalability. So this scale was developed for the Indonesian context as a whole, for the national context. And so that's for this study that's been scaled down to the context of Papua. And, I'm sure if you were to do, Herdian's research within the Papuan context specifically, you're probably going to come up with different data items. You might come up with different dimensions. Maybe there'd be similarities, but I'm sure there would be differences. And so I think we just need to be cautious, I suppose, when scaling that down. I think scaling down is less problematic than scaling up. So, for example, if you were to develop a wellbeing measurement tool for the Papuan context, I think that would be more challenging to kind of use that for example, a national Indonesian study. So what we did do to try and kind of counteract that potential issue is we did do some confirmatory factor analysis, which is essentially a statistical tool to see if the Indonesian Well-being Scale fits well to our sample and our data. And we did get good fit from those results, which is one thing. My preference would be to, if you had the resources to go out and engage with the community and check that this wellbeing scale is appropriate, but that's not always possible. So I think, again, it's just about being mindful of that scaling when you're using these kind of measures. Comparability is another one, and it's a big reason why critics of these kind of tools argue against using them, because you can't compare the results to different contexts. The Indonesian Wellbeing Scale shouldn't be applied in any other country. So to me, I don't think that's such a big issue. I think for this kind of analysis, I don't think there's really any important reason to be able to compare the findings and the results to other contexts. And I mean, for the reasons I presented as well, I think for people who sort of do think it's important to compare well-being levels across different countries, for example, I mean, what I've kind of alluded to throughout this presentation is that maybe it's not culturally appropriate to do that. So I suppose, that aside, I still think that there's a big place for doing this kind of research that's very Indonesia focused or very Papua focused, and using these measurement tools that are more context specific and more culturally appropriate. And finally, there's unsurprisingly a big bias toward global measurement tools. It's easy to use what's been used a lot before. These other global scales, they've been used in huge numbers of surveys. There's been a huge amount of analysis and validation done behind them. So it's easy to kind of pick them up and use them. Obviously, in existing data, we're usually going to see those tools there as well, which kind of is another barrier. to being able to analyze well-being from a more culturally nuanced perspective. However, I think it's just, again, being mindful about maybe we can use something different when we have the control and ability to do so. So where to from here? So this is, again, kind of just perhaps alluding to the points I've already made. So, if there are wellbeing researchers in this room and they'd be thinking, okay, well, what do we do with this? And how do we how do we try and incorporate more culturally nuanced and context-specific wellbeing measurement tools in our studies? So I think firstly, it's really just thinking carefully about the wellbeing measurement tool you use. As I just said, it's really easy to just pick something up that's global, that's well validated, that's using studies, there are hundreds or thousands of studies. I think we just need to be a bit more mindful about what tool we do use and think through it carefully. And research as much as our resources allow. So that could be, from something as basic as just reviewing the literature on well-being within a particular context, if literature exists, to engaging and discussing with research partners, if you yourself are from the context that you're doing analysis in or research in, maybe thinking through what your own experiences of well-being are and your peers and how it might differ from a tool you might use. To conducting the type of participatory research that Hodian did, if you have the resources to do that. And it doesn't have to be at a huge scale like Hodian did as well. It could just be kind of engaging with some NGOs in the area or discussing with other researchers in the field. And essentially apply the most relevant tool that you have with the available resources. So, from my perspective, I think it's great that the Indonesian Well-being Scale exists, and I hope people in the room might want to consider using it in future, and I'm sure Hodian would be very open to having a chat with you if you would like to use it. But I think, again, this comes to that scalability factor that, we're not always going to have the most, perfect culturally nuanced measurement tool at our disposal, but I think it's just about thinking through what might be the most appropriate that's available. So thank you so much for joining, everyone. So the paper has been published, so you can find it online. It's open access, which is great. I'm happy to point you in the direction of it or have a chat. My email is just there and answer any questions you might have. But for the moment, I'm happy to take any questions and have some discussion. I know that Hodian is on Zoom, so he might be answering some questions via chat, which will be relayed by Baksita. I'll answer them as well. So thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Kate and both Herian for the very excellent presentation, very clear. And we're going to have open Q&A, 3 at a time. Please mention your name, and then we go to Zoom if there are any questions.
Thanks very much, Kate. I'm glad you started academic. I have 2 quick questions. First, what is it about getting on the way suit that makes everybody so happy? And second, more seriously, I'm wondering about how you conducted the within-family interviews. I know you had multiple interviewees, right?
Yep.
Did you interview them separately, or were they all sitting in the room together at the same time? Lawyer for the spillover effects in terms of answers. And did you find any variation, intra-household variation in your measures?
Yeah, those are really good questions. Pat Budi is probably better placed to answer the specifics about the data collection. I think that they were done in separate rooms. Is that right? Or
Yeah, as best as we can, we separate them.
Yeah.
It doesn't always happen. Separate line.
Significant correlations?
We haven't looked at the.
That it would be really interesting to look at that though, because
you always happen different times because some of them will be working. You come back.
Yeah, no, but yeah, that would be really interesting to examine that intra level of variation, because we have 2 to 3, I think, mostly respondents from most households. So you certainly have the data to be able to do that.
But on the school wasting thing, seriously, that's what's driving the results, right?
Yeah.
Everything else is sort of easier. What is it about? Well, I guess one of the ways to happen.
I think what we don't control is the size of the migrant and social services definitely not good. So
Yeah,
So the.
Might be a sample size.
Deposits are close to risk.
the majority is migrant
The population size at in Jayapura,
in Jayapura and then Japan. So
not the respondent, right? The population size.
yeah, the population size is.
yeah. And I think that's reflected in the sample as well. So
And
And in the case of migrants, they're mostly. Or just start with.
yeah,
yeah.
but if there's a third baby in Jayapura, the is Bugis.
No, thank you.
You know what are called, sorry for the next step. Okay, yes.
Thank you, Kate. I have questions about the social relations. It is when we discuss about migrant and non-migrants, and one of the indicators of the Indonesian well-being scale is on social relations. So I wonder if what kind of questions you have in the questionnaire that indicate the social relations, because my question is related with the tension between migrant in Jayapura and in Papua. Generally, some tensions, for example, that happen between migrant and non-migrants, or between religious groups, and whether the question also indicate about process of assimilation and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of what questions are in this social relations, so I'm not sure if Henry-Ann's available to answer that one. So I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what those 6 questions comprise. But I mean, one potential explanation, I suppose, for that difference in the fact that migrants have higher levels of social relations than the non-migrant population is potentially just due to the fact that there's a huge migrant population in Jayapura. When I checked, it's over a third of the population are migrants, so kind of having that, sheer high numbers of migrants kind of compared to the other studies, as I said, they're probably done in Europe, where there's probably significantly lower portion of the population are migrants, kind of enables like you to have greater interconnections with that group by sheer numbers. So I'm not sure, has Henry commented anything in that sister?
He commented on the online question.
Okay.
Is it this? Henry, do you want to comment on this question about if you want to talk more a little bit about the social interactions questions, if you're available to talk. Okay, well, we're at it. We can
I think
maybe Henry can prepare the answer, and we can move on to the
Question, yeah.
the online question first, and then give.
We have a couple questions for you, Kate. I see that a couple questions for Herdian has been answered. But Eliza Hunt is wondering, it's interesting to consider the findings from Kate related to higher well-being of migrants than non-migrants in Jayapura. Could this be just an artifact of assessment tool, as if this tool was developed overwhelmingly using Japanese? There are questions of cross-cultural validity in terms of construct generalizability for your Papuan sample that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really, really good point and a really good question. And something that we did consider when analysing these results, kind of based on that level of bias. The Indonesian Well-being Scale might be more relatable, might be more relevant for migrants compared to non-migrants, based on the fact of that consultation process that was conducted. So I mean, the confirmatory factor analysis we did kind of maybe helps a little bit, but not entirely to that point. I think that kind of bias could still be there. And again, I think that's about being really mindful about using these kind of measurement tools and what kind of biases it could bring out based on kind of who is consulting that process. But yeah, absolutely, that could certainly be a feature. And I'm just trying to think of ways that we could have kind of tackled that a bit. I suppose we could have looked at which we didn't do, we could have looked at kind of the distributions of the IWS of the migrants compared to non-migrants and kind of see if there was kind of some kind of tendency of the non-migrants to respond in a certain way. But I think really, I mean, ideally you just want to be able to do qualitative research for that, and that was you know, kind of if those reasonable forces are available to kind of engage with the community and check the validity of this scale. And that's not kind of the statistical validity, it's the content validity of asking, okay, is this scale relevant for you? I think is advantageous if you can do it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Pete, Michael, a bit more of a macro question in a way. And you mentioned, Kate, about the policy implications. So I was thinking in the Australian context, the Treasury is being encouraged to look at well-being as a driver of policy. So it makes me wonder to what degree are Indonesian policymakers also being encouraged to look at a broader well-being scale, whether it's the one we've been discussing here or others, in putting together policies that affect the Indonesian people as a whole. So I know this is a discussion about migrants in Jayapura, but I'm asking a bit more broadly what the impact of the IWS would be.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And anecdotally, I have heard whisperings that maybe the Indonesian government is looking at doing something quite similar to what Australian Treasury is doing, or at least thinking in that way, which is really exciting. And Herdian as well might have some more kind of information on that. But I mean, from my perspective, and I'm biased, but I think there's huge value in kind of using these kind of wellbeing frameworks to think about policy. And it's not necessarily just the evaluation side, it's not the like metrics, it's not the data, but it's really thinking about from the very beginning, you know, thinking about policy development, what actually matters to people, what does wellbeing mean, what are the wellbeing goals of a society, and how does that policy match up to that? And and there's kind of trade-offs in the sense that a policy might improve wellbeing in one area and decrease it in another. Like the COVID lockdowns are a big example of that. Improved our physical health in some ways by reducing transmission, but there are huge costs to mental health and things like that. And having that kind of wellbeing framework allows you to at least think about that and have a clear framework for thinking through those implications and thinking and discussing that. So this is kind of a side kind of point, but the research I'm currently doing with the Centre for Policy Development is looking really closely at this and looking at, okay, what governments are implementing wellbeing frameworks effectively and what are they doing? And one really effective tool is mandating programs and policies to, essentially fill out a form like every 3 months, every 6 months to think about, okay, what wellbeing areas does our policy impact on and how does it impact? It's not just a tick box exercise, it's really thinking through kind of those implications. So yeah, in terms of, I suppose, the Indonesia context, I mean, I don't know if it would be specifically the Indonesian Well-being Scale or kind of another tool. I think, and Herdian might have a different opinion, but I feel like this is probably more of a research tool. I feel that if you were to kind of have a wellbeing framework for government policy, it would probably be a bit broader. It would ask a different question, probably not what does wellbeing mean to you, but what are the goals for Indonesian society, or what do you feel you need to live a good life? We'll have a slightly different focus. But yeah, I do think kind of at a national government level, it can be really helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add, I think the BPS added the life satisfaction and happiness question since 2017. But given what we know, and I don't know whether it's, I don't think it's being used for to drive policy. Yes, it's heavy. Yeah, but
I have another question.
Your question. Tony and then Ross.
Yeah, related to his question, really.
I mean, I think a lot of people in this room and elsewhere would love to see the emergence of some trustable welfare index. So my questions are firstly, how do you see the progress, you and your colleague see the progress globally towards uniformity in some kind of standard emerging that could be, begin to have clout because of being trusted and so forth? And related to that, I suppose, is whether the welfare index you're talking about is entirely perceived by the subject, as opposed to objective measures of health and income and education and all the things that we might think are more physically measurable and trustable. But yes, that's the question.
Yeah. I mean, onto the second point first, I think that I don't think they're a replacement. I don't think like a subjective well-being scale is a replacement for the more objective measures. I think they should be kind of measured in conjunction with each other. Interestingly, I mean, when you look at the IWS scale data items, they are all subjective, but a lot of them are relatively objective questions in a way. So they kind of do kind of have that balance there. But no, I certainly think that they should be looked at in conjunction with each other. And I mean, for me, and again, Herdia might have a different perspective, but this is more of a psychological tool from my perspective. It's more of a research tool. And I think that, like obviously, like looking at kind of health outcomes, financial security outcomes and things like that are really important to do. The extent to which they correlate with each other, I haven't looked into in too much detail. In regards to the first question, I suppose about, I think it was more about like best practice cases, I suppose, in terms of governments doing this internationally. Again, from my perspective, at a policy level, at a government level, I don't feel that kind of an index that like creates a score for every citizen and compares well-being is necessarily that helpful. I think what is helpful is just learning what those well-being dimensions are. So what Herdia did in his study, to kind of better understand how we should be tailoring and developing policy. One standout, I suppose, government is Wales. So they've got the Future Generations Act, which you might have heard of. So that's kind of ensuring the well-being of citizens now and into the future as well. So kind of having that environmental sustainability aspect as well. And the way they've developed their act, essentially they have a commissioner that's responsible for calling people out. And they've had huge policy changes, like they put a moratorium on road development. Well, no roads could be developed in Wales because they were trying to move to a more greener way of transportation. So that would be kind of a standout case at a national level of kind of how that's being developed. And I think there are a range of reasons why that's been so effective. I think one reason is having kind of that future focus as well as present focus. Secondly is like there was a huge consultation done with people in Wales asking what's the Wales you want for the future. And also the huge amount of like governance that's gone into it and accountability as well. Like, having a commissioner that can make policymakers and politicians accountable for their decisions is really important.
Thanks. Can I start just by saying I really like this work, and I think it's great that we're asking these kind of questions, especially around cultural nuances. So my questions relate to that. The first point might be for the online speaker, but that third column there, personal attitude to unconditionally accepting life circumstances. So we know, like in Malaysia around the happiness index, that the unhappiest state of Malaysia is the most politically active. And the happiest state is the state that has very little or no change of government, and people essentially feel like they can't change the thing. So that goes to the question of whether, this acceptance of life circumstances or nasib maybe in the Indonesian context. Yeah, takdir, nasib, I don't know, is potentially problematic there, right? And secondly, I guess with relating to the question, you've mentioned the term cultural nuance a lot and the cultural dimensions of this. Is it not problematic then if you're doing a study on Papua and Jayapura that a bunch of economists, to throw the cat amongst the pigeons, that a bunch of economists didn't include a Papuan cultural expert? Like, wouldn't that have helped you frame the study. If culture is so crucial, why aren't we including cultural studies experts in these surveys?
There's a really good point. I suppose to the first point, I mean, I'll let Herdian talk about that specific kind of dimension. But yeah, I mean, it goes to the whole issue of wellbeing measurement generally and the biases and how the cognitive processes that go behind answering these questions and things like that. And yeah, I mean, I think this kind of scale is an improvement on that, but I think it's still potentially prone to to those same issues. And we saw there's potentially a degree of social desirability bias amongst the sample, because we saw kind of pretty much everyone responding positively. And it might well be that certain population groups are even more likely to respond positively, like just as you mentioned. So I think that's a really important point. And like in response to the second point, that's an absolutely good point as well. I mean, we did have a co-author in Papua, so we did kind of have have that aspect as well.
An economist wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But no, that's
certainly, yeah.
What is it with you and economists?
I actually find it really fascinating, because I think it's this merger now between people like us in culture, history, language, and economists. I actually think we could do really great work together if we collaborated. So I like I said, I'm a huge fan of this work.
It's good to hear that perspective and to emphasize that, because I think kind of those greater collaborations amongst different areas, and not just amongst researchers necessarily, but amongst people on the ground, amongst NGOs on the ground, amongst experts on the ground as well. Like experts being kind of not necessarily academics or practitioners, just people who have a really good knowledge of the culture. I think is really important. And I agree. Slightly hypocritical kind of put that perspective forward without having gone through kind of those processes as you've mentioned as well. And I found this, and it's not something I really talked about in this paper, but it's probably something I should have. But something I've talked about in another paper I've written, which similar kind of analysis, but looking at the Australian context, looking at child wellbeing in Australia, where I didn't apply a tool that existed, but I used existing data, like an existing longitudinal study, to identify indicators of well-being based on a well-being framework. Like that was conducted through participatory approaches, but highlighting, I suppose, that against that juxtaposition that we advocate for the value of including children's voices in that. But in the study I didn't involve children in the process of selecting indicators from the data and things like that. Again, like I think we should maybe be a little bit easier on ourselves in the sense that like there's a huge amount of resources to do that and things like that. But I think kind of raising those points and being more aware of our positionality and everything like that is really important. And I really hope to take that on in kind of future studies.
Did you address the question about the acceptance or you did?
Yeah, I think Herdian's probably a bit better placed to
Can we check with Herdian if he has something to say about both the social interaction and also acceptance?
Yes.
If he does.
Yeah.
Mas Herdian mentioned that he's not sure he can answer live.
Oh yeah.
So we can just call him out. Mas Herdian.
It's okay if you have to move on.
We'd like to hear from him too. If it's available.
I would like to respond to Ross.
Yes.
So I think I agree to the basic that looking for this. The Indonesian well-being is that so far we always get a problem in measuring Indonesian well-being, like the standard, as you can see the standard question, like whether you're happy. Indonesian tend to say yes, we are happy, and it is actually consistent through IFRS, through individual survey, and so on. And it just we feel that we need to find something. But certainly at that time we not an expert on developing those things, so that we just take something that has been developed. Kate was know this person, but certainly let's listen to what Adrian respond. But I think for us is we are more welcome to develop more what is it the right strategy to measure Indonesia well-being. Because we know that the implementation of the international has typically not giving much variation, and this has been proven as well.
Thank you. So yes.
Herdian, internet is not too stable, so he cannot answer, but we do have a couple questions for you, Kate. Chris Manning has a question. I really enjoyed the presentation. I wonder what socioeconomic patterns seems to have contributed to lower levels of well-being among non-migrant populations. A couple of possible factors come to mind. Dispossession of land, a lack of access to formal sector jobs compared to migrants. Second, can you offer any explanation of better outcomes for migrants from highland regions?
Yeah.
If I can please read one more, is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
okay? Terry Hall has a question. Was sex/gender a control variable? And can you comment on difference in well-being between male and female respondents who were either born in Jayapura or migrated?
Yeah. So onto that first question. So yeah, it's a really good point that I don't think I emphasize that. Obviously, we had a bunch of control variables. There's like almost certainly, the variable bias there. There's probably things that we didn't control that are contributing to this. And I think all those aspects, potentially, contributing to this, to the well-being gap. You read the second question?
The one about well-being of non-migrant population.
Yeah.
What socioeconomic patterns seem to have contributed to lower levels of well-being among non-migrants population?
So essentially kind of even controlling for all these variables, we did kind of see that difference. So I think all the additional aspects that I mentioned are probably influential. And the second,
can you offer any explanation of better outcomes for migrants from highland regions?
Yeah, so that's something I think that would be really interesting to look into further. We didn't, personally with my lack of knowledge, I writing the paper, we didn't have too much to add, I suppose, apart from this exist. Noting again the issues with sample size of that. Gentlemen, did you have anything to kind of add to this, explaining this finding?
Yeah, so this I also, although we implemented, but there also have some reservation. What exactly they're saying, and if they say actually comparing to, particularly for the recent migrant, comparing to the situation before they move, if it is actually that, then it is easy to explain why the mountain people are happy. They just, in a way, once they move to Jayapura, they got access to a lot of things. So the mountain area became very remote. And from the other thing is that at the moment, land grabbing in the cities are quite common, and so they can basically easy to get a place to stay, and so I can see why they becoming like happy. If that is a reference, is actually their situation before that. But so that is about the reference. I'm not that sure how I say.
We're not asking them to reference.
Yes, no, we don't. So, but when they respond exactly what I'd like to
Potentially relative improvements.
yeah, I get that.
Yeah, but I think if to look into this a bit more, it would be really helpful to know and really interesting to know the circumstances of their life before they moved. So that would help unpack that a little bit more.
But in Jayapura, it's mountain people are very strong. In each conflict between mountain and coastal people, the mountain people always defeat the coastal people. Even there are a lot of funny story about that. So there's people in close to the lake, and these people are mostly fishermen who can go to the lake, and they were conflict with the mountain people. For the reason is very simple. This group actually creating a ringtone that by having a rap that's saying that mountain people are kind of stupid or something. And they actually attack all these mountain people, attack the people, and those people actually swim, and the mountain people cannot swim. None of them cannot swim, so they save actually. But in the Jayapura situation is actually like that very many people are the most of people are actually worried with the mounted people. The governor is mounted people. Almost all people in the local government in Jayapura are mounted people. Almost head of school is they also mounted people. So,
Yeah, I think that, did you answer Terry Hall's question about gender? What do you?
Oh, gender. Yeah. So we did look. So gender, it was a control variable, but I didn't put this in the slides, and I'm keeping myself now. So we did look at kind of men and women separately to see if there was kind of one particular group driving that difference, and it looked to be coming from both men and women. But remember, I think the finding for women was more significant. So yeah, probably both. But we have greater certainty that kind of the finding is definitely we have more confidence that the finding is true for women.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I'm just interested because you define migrant and non-migrants, but I'm interested whether in the variables you have indigenous Papuans versus non-indigenous, like OAP and non-APE, because that's one aspect that's important when you talk about Papua. And then a possible, so you don't have that kind of data.
No, we didn't, unfortunately. And again, I think it's just because that was like what this kind of topic wasn't what we were thinking about when we were doing kind of the survey design. So if we had that information, and that's why I specifically used the term non-migrant and migrant, because from the non-migrants, I don't know whether they're indigenous Papuans or not.
And to the definition of migrant itself, like as I understand, when you go to Papua, as Pagudi mentioned, there will be a lot of people from Highland who actually have a house in Jayapura and live, but they're actually back and forth because they're civil servants in the Highland, but they usually have house in Papua. Like, would you have that kind of data in terms of, they might not be like migrant, but they're like Papuans who live in the Highland but have a house in Papua. That's why, because they could access basic public services in Jayapura.
Yeah. So our definition wasn't all that nuanced again, because we just didn't have that data available. So it's literally just where they were born. So if they were reported they were born in Jayapura, non-migrant. If they were noted they were born elsewhere, it's not migrant. So unfortunately, again, with the data we collected, we just couldn't go into that kind of detail.
And the idea with that question was we were going to capture the childhood exposure to malaria. The original design we weren't thinking about it at the moment.
So it's the Chua, the Chua is the information.
Where they were.
If you had focused on that issue, would you have got permission to do the?
What, sorry?
If you had focused on the ethnic indigenous issue, would you have got permission to do the research? I'm a bit surprised that you did get permission.
To get funding.
No, to get Indonesian permission.
Oh, Indonesian permission. I don't know.
we can identify by name, because we ask their name. So we have data on their name, and so based on their name, we know actually from which clan they come from. But then we need to recode those one by one. So in the case of this one, actually name could be
Yeah, no, I just, well, I mean, did you get all the permissions that the foreigners have to get to do research, or?
Oh, at the time
It has a, we went to this is a ANU IRB approval, ethics and Indonesia. I think Indonesian is in penelitian. We
Didn't actually get the Indonesian government permission.
Because the field, the field were all uniform universitas Cenawasi. We work with Universitas Cenawasi, and in Ambon we work with Universitas Patimura.
So the local, our local partner, you have to ask those.
They do the, but the questionnaire, everything has ANU.
Are you worried this study might be used, by the government to say, look, see, migrants are really happy that we connected us.
Actually, this is the reason why we are worried that this is showing that non-migrant, the non-migrant are happy.
Yeah.
So the flux of migrant in Papua, certainly why this create a conflict and so on. Because the local people are not happy with the so many migrants. So this welfare is actually indicating the problem. So if the measurement of welfare is actually quite, so yeah, the local people is higher.
And they were not green at that time. We didn't go to green. But so okay, this Bangkok, yeah. Yeah, the Ministry of Home Affairs.
So hopefully the government actually read the full paper, not just kind of the headline, but I know that's, yeah, not always the case.
Just two short
Okay.
clarificatory
That's
questions.
right.
Ian Al-Haddad has a question whether this is Kota Jayapura or Kabupaten Jayapura. If it's Kabupaten, did you include Kota Jayapura in the sampling? Nani from UNICEF has a question whether you look at the ethnicity of the migrants from coastal and mountain regions, because even though they migrated from the same regions, they might have different ethnicity. Ethnicity is one of the strong identity.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's Jayapura Regency that we looked at. So the people who born in Jayapura Regency are non-migrants, and from elsewhere are migrants. And yeah, and unfortunately, we didn't have that those questions on ethnicity. But as Apuri was saying, potentially you could use the last names to at least kind of link to particular plans. But yeah, I mean, obviously if we had our time again, we probably would have included a bit more information on that.
Okay, any more questions?
Just very quickly on that.
Okay, last question from Michael. Yes.
Salary for example, I guess that's broad term, right? That it should include income, non-salary income like from fishermen. And I was wondering the extent of relationship between that variable with well-being. How big is the impact of salary coefficient?
Yeah. So from memory, I think it was salary from all sources.
Earning basically,
Yeah, yeah, all earnings.
But yeah, I didn't remember the impact of the if you put the look at it, yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember like you about the coefficient for the salary, what that was in the model.
Yeah, because I'm guessing that probably drives a lot of the results.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when we look at the kind of graph, that gap was huge. We just looked at the histogram between the three, and when you control for things, I think that kind of reduced a little bit. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, earnings typically in most contexts have a huge impact on well-being. And yeah, from memory, I think the coefficient is quite large.
Okay, I think that's it for today. So thank you so much for the speaker. Thank you for everyone for participating. Thank you. Yeah,